this morning? Can I hear a big loud amen? Again, invite you to the Bible study hour. I also invite you to be back tonight for a drive-through reception at 4:30 for Fred and Linda Lewis and for 6 p.m. worship. I'll leave you with a blessing straight from the passage that we looked at this morning. Acts chapter 20, verse 24. May you run the race. May you complete the task that Jesus himself has given to you. May you be the one who testifies to the good news of God's grace. Amen. Hey everybody, welcome to the Bible Study Hour. We are here, your announcement guys, and we want to say a big thank you to you for making it a point to be on time and in Bible study today. We've got a few announcements for you, and how are we going to give them to the folks?
Well, I think it'd be fun. Let's go to different locations around the church, just explore a little bit.
Road trip. Let's do this. Hello, folks. We are here outside of entrance 3, and we want you back to church tonight at 4:30. We're going to have a drive-through reception for Fred and Linda Lewis. Bring a card, bring a note of encouragement, and a brief word for Fred and Linda. That starts at 4:30. We need you here on time and keeping that line moving. We want to show Fred and Linda that we love them and care for them. That starts at 4:30. We do have a service at 6 p.m. and that service is meant to honor Fred and Linda. Fred will have the microphone. He'll speak a word to us. So if you're comfortable being in person for worship, please be here at 6. If you're not comfortable with that, the drive-through reception is for you. So tonight, 4:30 drive-through reception and 6 p.m. worship. We want you there because we're thankful for all that Fred and Linda have done for the Lord and for our church over these last 40 years. Got anything to say?
I'm working on my miming skills, so I thought that was good.
Gotcha. Hey folks, we're here in the Resource Center. For the next couple of weeks, we are going to give you announcements pushing you to sign up for Right Now Media. As a member of the greatest church on the planet, you have access to Right Now Media, which is filled with thousands of Bible studies, all kinds of documentaries and movies and kids programming, something for your family. Everybody in your household can find something on Right Now Media. Fun things and serious things, entertainment and Bible study. So we want you to go to our website. If you have not already signed up for Right Now Media, find the resource tab and sign up. When?
Today. We'll be reading from Colossians 3, starting in verse 1. If you're there, can I get a big loud amen? Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things.
Jody, if you're going to impersonate me,
I got the...
you need much longer pauses than that. Folks, just want to give you a quick sneak peek. Next Sunday evening is Super Bowl Sunday. So what does that mean for us? It means our Sunday evening service is going to be moved up till 4 p.m. We still want you here. Show up. We'll have a great night of worship. I'll be preaching. See you Super Bowl Sunday at 4 p.m. evening worship. Carry on.
For you have died. I'm going to leave you with the blessing.
We're at our last spot of our drive-through announcements. Jody, where are we?
We're at the Rock. I know this place really well, but it looks different.
What happened here this weekend?
We had our Disciple Now here this weekend.
Absolutely. Disciple Now is actually wrapping up pretty much right now. And I want to say a big thank you to all those that pitched in and helped this weekend. I know Eric and Caleb are thankful, and I know our youth are thankful. And you can still be praying for our youth. We pray that the fruit from Disciple Now weekend is long-lasting fruit. We want this to be a spiritually forming weekend for a long time to come for the teenagers of our church.
Absolutely.
Give them the outro, Jody.
Outro time. 11 o'clock today in the worship center if you have not joined us for worship yet. And then tonight,
4:30 drive-through reception for Fred and Linda, and 6 p.m. evening worship. You'll want to hear a word from Fred.
signing out.
Brother Michael, good to see you. Okay. Good morning. This is the First Baptist Church of Sulphur Springs, radio Bible class, and I'm privileged to follow this week the two most excellent teachers, Eddie Northcutt and James Litzler, and happy to be here as well. Let's open with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for our time together. Thank you for those at home. Pray that your watch care would be over them, that you would touch, heal their spirits and their bodies. In Jesus' name, amen. Now that Eddie is here this morning, I have a question I need to ask. I'm sure everybody in this room and probably in this church except me had heard this story already. It happened in a town near here some years ago, and the Baptist church in this town got very concerned that a bar and grill, emphasis on bar, tavern, was opening down the street from the church. And the whole church began to pray, and they covenanted to pray that God would not let that happen, that God would prevent that from happening, that God would intervene. And 3 days before that tavern was supposed to open, it was struck by lightning and burned to the ground. And you've heard this, Eddie. That tavern was struck by lightning and burned to the ground, and the church rejoiced. And then a month later, they got a summons. The tavern owner had hired a team of lawyers to sue the church for the lightning strike. And the church, of course, brought its attorneys in, and the judge heard them, and the lawyers for the tavern owner said this was a deliberate attack by this church by using prayer to destroy this man's place of business. And the attorneys for the church said, we did not do anything. The church did not do anything. You cannot tie anything that was done to that tavern to anything the church was doing. And then they waited. These were their opening remarks. The judge looked at both sides and said, I don't know how I'm going to rule in this case, especially now that it seems clear that the tavern owner believes in prayer and the church doesn't. Eddie, that wasn't you, was it? Okay. Just had to check and see. Fred Lewis. Yeah, come in, sir. You want to speak?
We're alive. Hey, we're just thankful for y'all, and Bruce is going to be over this. So we can see you. Oh.
If you...
Just a minute. Hey, thank y'all for being here today, and it's a privilege to have been part of the radio Bible class and television ministry through the years. Bruce Welch is going to kind of be over the all of the adult Bible study hour. So if y'all have any needs or anything like that, y'all feel free to come see Bruce or call him. He's only one call away, okay? Thank y'all for being here today. We're glad to have y'all.
Thank you, Fred. Oh, Fred Lewis, who has been such a mainstay of all that is done and said at this church. How many years? 40? Nearly 40 years. 81. Yeah, right on the edge of 40 years, and what a blessing he has been to so many of us individually in this church by all the attention that he shows. Just a incredibly energetic, caring man, and his wife and his family. So he will be greatly missed. We are today in Luke chapter 5, coming after the lesson Eddie taught last week on Jesus' first sermon, which he actually delivered in his hometown after his ministry had been going on for a while around the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And Eddie gave a very good description and explanation of what happened there and how he simply was rejected by the home folk. Well, He returned to the Sea of Galilee area. We see that he was carrying out healings at Capernaum, and his reputation had gotten so great that Jesus, when he spoke, crowds would gather from all over. Crowds of people came to hear him. Crowds of people came to be healed because his healing ministry was already evident. And here we open in chapter 5, verse 1. As the crowd was pressing in on Jesus to hear God's word, he was standing by Lake Gennesaret. He saw two boats at the edge of the lake. The fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, which belonged to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the land. Then he sat down and was teaching the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch." "Master," Simon replied, "we've worked hard all night long and caught nothing. But if you say so, I'll let down the nets." When they did this, they caught a great number of fish, and their nets began to tear. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. They came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, because I'm a sinful man, Lord." For he and all those with him were amazed at the catch of the fish they had taken. And so were James and John, Zebedee's sons, who were Simon's partners. "Don't be afraid," Jesus told Simon. "From now on you will be catching people." Then they brought their boats to land, left everything, and followed him. This was not the first time they had met Jesus. The book of Matthew and the book of John make clear that he had already encountered them. He had already had them following him a little bit. They had taken part and followed in his ministry a little, but they were still tied to their career, which was as fishermen. Now, Jesus was preaching near the shoreline. The towns that he was teaching at were towns that were on the Sea of Galilee. It says Gennesaret. It's known by other names, the Sea of Galilee, Kinnereth, and Lake Tiberias. The term sea is given even though it is not salted. It does have some salt springs flowing under it, but the salt water level is very, very low. And so even though it's fresh water, they tended to call it a sea, and most commonly known as Sea of Galilee. It says that the crowd that Jesus was speaking to was pressing in on him. The word pressing is the same word used for when the stone was rolled across the tomb. We're not saying that, he was backed up and 5 feet from a crowd of several thousand. They were up against his face and standing near to his toes. It was virtually impossible to speak to any other than those who had him completely surrounded. And he saw the two boats there, and he asked to put out, and that way he could be in the boat with that little separation. It was a physical distance needed to be able to speak to the larger numbers of people that were there. I pride myself on being a fisherman, but I am far from an expert compared to the best fishermen out there. The best fishing experiences I ever had were Toledo Bend, right there on the Texas-Louisiana border, which is itself the largest lake touching on or near Texas. And it is massive. It's a huge lake. I love fishing that lake. I love the time that I've been out there and with my uncle have caught dozens of blue cats and dozens of crappie. And I just loved it at a time before there were limits and you could do some of those. But nonetheless, even with the limits, it's a very generous thing. I love the bass fishing. 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to have bass running in some of the rivers. We're going to have the sand bass. We're going to have the white bass running, various others running in February. And it's a great time to pull your boat up onto a sandbar and start fishing. 2 boats there. What were these boats like? Are we talking 2 little rowboats? Well, we're blessed that in 1986, archaeologists in Israel discovered a Sea of Galilee boat from the time of Jesus. They had to seal it in a wax bath for 12 years after finding it in 1986 to make sure the wood did not completely disintegrate. And having done that, it's now preserved and in a museum there. What we know about this boat is it was the standard size, the most workable size in the days before outboards for a boat used by fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. It is 27 feet long, it is 7.5 feet wide, and it has sides that are up to 4.5 feet. So it will enclose quite a bit. It had oar locks for 4 oars, 2 on each side, staggered, and an emplacement for a small sail. So the pictures we see of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee and a boat with a sail are accurate. And 27 feet is a pretty good sized boat. A boat that size had a capacity of 1,650 pounds, or a little bit more. Maybe a little bit more if the weather was calm, maybe a little bit less if the weather was violent. And believe me, the Sea of Galilee could get very violent. The Golan Heights on its east shore go up to 3,000 feet. The Sea of Galilee is the lowest freshwater body on earth at negative 730 feet. Go even further downstream in the Jordan, you come to the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point on earth. But when the cold wind comes off the Golan Heights and then starts dropping towards the Sea of Galilee, and it hits the warm water coming to the Sea of Galilee, you get violent storms that can turn up in a split second. And they are very violent indeed. They had one in 2012 that was so violent that it all but wrecked the Sea of Galilee town of Tiberias, today in Israel, 2012, and the town of Tiberias is the size of Rockwall, like 45,000 people or more, and it got zapped. Imagine being in this boat with 10 or 11 people at full capacity in the middle of a storm, or 12 or 13 people, depending on their body weight and full capacity in the middle of a storm, which Jesus was, as we see in another point of the gospel. It's not the place you want to be, is on the Sea of Galilee in that kind of boat, but that type of boat was absolutely outstanding for fishing. It could carry significant amounts, and its draft was very shallow. That significant a boat, a good bass boat is 16 to 18 feet. This is half again as long at 27 feet. But a boat that shallow draft could be pulled right up on the beach, just right up there. In fact, just a few inches is all it took to float. Amazing construction. Cedar seems to have been the primary wood used in it. They seem to have cedar planking and the joints and all of this through there. An amazing little boat for its day. But we'd call it a medium-sized boat now. And that's what Jesus asked to push out a bit, and there he sat. It said, 2 boats on the edge of the lake. The fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. Now that's a painstaking task that you have to do before you go in and go to bed. Today we do it because we don't want the bad mussels and stuff like that infecting one lake to another. Then they did it because the nets were made of flax and they had to be cleaned, or they would deteriorate rapidly if that were not done. He got into one of the boats, which belonged to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the land. Then he sat down and was teaching the crowds from the boat. 2 reasons for sitting. I learned long ago you don't stand in a canoe. And a boat, if there's the slightest bit of waves, isn't the best place to be standing. Secondly, it was the common thing for teachers to sit when they were instructing. Teachers sat for instruction. They stood if they're making a person or a leader or anyone else stood when they're making a pronouncement. But a leader or a teacher, or as the term they used, rabbi or master, tended to sit during long sessions of teaching. And the crowd would stand. The teacher sitting, the students standing. I don't know why our high schools never adopted that system. It would sure solve the after lunchtime thing of kids going to sleep in the middle of my boring notes. They'd have no choice but to stand through it. But somehow, in our culture, we didn't do it that way. And he sat down and was teaching the crowds from the boat as he sat there. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch." How big was this sea? Well, they have a good number on it. It is half again larger than Lake Fork. If we estimate Lake Fork at about 27,000 surface acres, then this was about 40,000. Just a little bit smaller than Tawakoni's 43,000. So it was definitely a lake. Maximum depth of 142 feet. That's pretty good depth. The reason being that the Sea of Galilee sits on the northern point of the great Rift Valley of the earth. The Rift Valley that goes to the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, the Red Sea, through Ethiopia, all the way down as far south as Zimbabwe and Mozambique, but really cuts a swath through Kenya and Tanzania. That is an earthquake-derived thing, and that is an earthquake belt, and there are fractures. So definitely, the Sea of Galilee has a neat fracture, and 142 feet, it actually drops off pretty quick if you get too far from shore. There's a pretty fast drop, and going down to that. So we're talking some deep water. And Jesus told him, "Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Was Jesus a professional catcher of fish? He was a carpenter. And his town of Nazareth, as Eddie pointed out last week, was not on the Sea of Galilee. It wasn't even on the main road. You had to depart from the main road that ran from the coast to Galilee, to the Sea of Galilee to the coast was the main road. You had to take if you were in Nazareth, you needed to go there for some reason. You had to get there, and you had to go uphill to get there. And it wasn't a highly thought of town, as we remember. Is it Nathaniel or Bartholomew who made the famous statement, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Well, Jesus was not from a fishing town. Peter was. Peter had been fishing his whole life for a living, and he'd been fishing this particular lake his whole life for a living. He knew that lake, and he knew it well. And now this novice is telling him, this novice to fishing the lake. I mean, Peter knew every good hole in the lake. He knew every good spot in the lake. He just knew that lake inside out. I've read how the very successful Texas fisherman Keith Combs has, to my knowledge, I don't know if he's won a major bass tournament like Bass Masters, like #1 in the nation, but he's won just about everything else, or come in second, third, fourth at every major tournament. And of course, he has a house down near Sam Rayburn. He did very well at Lake Fork in 2014. But they say what he does is, it's the same thing that my friend Mike Singletary used to do when he played for Baylor, when he played for the Chicago Bears. He would spend a whole week watching the other team on tape over and over and over and over. He did this all the way through his career with Mike Ditka and the Chicago Bears. Keith Combs does that with the lakes he goes to. He'll go out on a lake and spend hours or even days with his depth finder, just checking it out. A fisherman knows good and well where there's a good school of fish one day may not be where they are the next. There's no guarantee of that, but at least he can see the structure. He gets to know the structure. He gets to know all of that. I'm sure the same mentality exists in the great bass fishermen, Kevin Van Dam or Roland Masters. So picture these men who are real experts at it, and then picture me. I know some fishing. I cast. I'm an excellent caster. I can hit from 60 feet out. I can hit a 6-inch circle about every time. But my knowledge of where the fish are, my knowledge of the structure, all of that, I'll fish alongside a brush pile. I'll do the best I can. I was once in Lake Naivasha, speaking of the Rift Valley. One of the great Rift Valley lakes in Kenya is Lake Naivasha, a freshwater lake of fairly good size. I was fishing out there once with 2 missionaries, and they were Texans, and I was proud to say they were getting skunked, and I wasn't. And I finally just wanted to rear back, and I had a Rapala, And I don't think it was anything more than a Zebco 202, may have been a 404. But I just let fly. And to my horror, I was aiming for this side of a brush pile, but I was aiming it. I had good wind behind me, and that lure was going to fly over 100 feet. It cleared the brush pile and landed in a herd of hippos. And I had this, I could see their red ears, they're sticking above the water. I had this horrible image of a 6-hook Rapala sticking in a baby hippo's ear. And you don't enrage a mama hippo. You don't enrage a hippo, period. And here I'd cast that lure in the middle of it. And all of a sudden the water just exploded. I said, oh no, that's what's happened. But then I saw the flicker of a fish, and I brought it in, and it came through a brush pile. I don't know how I got it through the brush pile without breaking the line. And it is the largest largemouth bass I've ever caught. 7 pounds, 12 ounces. Now, most people in Sulphur Springs have caught bigger than that. But 7 pounds, 12 ounces there in a Rift Valley lake in Kenya. I somehow got that thing in without the line breaking and without hooking a hippo. I was also mindful of the crocodiles that were on the shore, which kind of had me nervous as well. But I'm not an expert. If I have something like that happen, it's dumb luck. It's just blind luck. And so I am not going to walk up to Keith Combs or Kevin Von Dam or Roland Masters and try to advise them on their next move in a tournament. You know, my advice would make about as much sense as me telling them, I think you should cast an old-fashioned topwater jitterbug into that thick moss bank over there and then just try to haul it in, see what happens. Now, that's just not going to work. It's not good advice, and coming from me to any of these experts, it would not be good advice. And that's essentially what Jesus has just done and said to Peter. Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch. That's counterintuitive. You don't use nets in deep water, especially a lake that's 140 feet deep. You did not have the technology, did not have the winch technology or the cranking technology or the block and tackle technology in those days to even do that, if it would even work. The fish were going to be deep in daytime. Now, they were closer into shore at night, so Peter and his partners could fish the shallows at night, and that's apparently what they had been doing all night without a catch. And as they had trailed their nets, they knew where the fish were supposed to be, and they simply were not there. They simply were not there. In daytime, fish would go to the deep. They would leave that area. And Jesus is saying, put your net down into the deep. Well, they could only drop it so far, and it wouldn't be deep enough to haul them in. This was not the best fishing advice that an expert had ever had. Peter was an expert. His brother Andrew was an expert. Their partners, James, John, and the old man Zebedee, were experts, and they were especially experts on this lake. They'd fished it their whole lives. They did it for a living. I don't know how many among us would love to fish for a living. I don't mean the great bulk hauls of fish, but I mean like a bass tournament. There are people who can do bass tournaments for a living and do pretty well at it. I'm not one of them. I would like to be, but I'm not. Master, Simon replied, we've worked hard all night long and caught nothing. They've been feeding those nets out all night, over and over. And nighttime was a time to catch them. A lot of us have fished at night and had great success with, a light on the water or whatever, bringing in whatever we're after. But if you say so, I'll let down the nets. The very word master means he has been with Jesus already, watching his ministry, taking part in it a little bit. But if you say so, I'll let down the nets. The nets had just gotten clean and were on their way to drying. So what Jesus is asking just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Plus, they're tired. They fished all night. They are ready to go to bed. What is the economic value if there is some success? Scholars now tell us that Sea of Galilee fish were greatly desired in Rome. We know the type of fish they were catching. We know by the description. There were 3 main varieties of fish you got from the Sea of Galilee that are mentioned in the Gospels. There is a catfish, and they say that word for catfish is the actual word in Luke chapter 11, When Jesus says in Luke chapter 11, if a man asks his father for a fish, will he give him a snake? Well, that word for snake is not strictly snake. It's closer to a word for eel, catfish. And the catfish in the Sea of Galilee look kind of like an eel. I'm told they actually taste pretty good, but the trouble is for Jews, they are not kosher. They can't eat them. We would not consider them beautiful. I don't know about you, but I love bringing in a beautiful channel cat that has kind of a rainbow type speckling to it. I think it's a nice thing. I almost hate to eat them. I hate to clean them. I hate to kill them. But these things look more like a grinnell without teeth. And they have the ability to live out of water for hours, kind of like a chughead catfish here. And they are known to crawl. They're not the great long-distance walking catfish, but they do have the ability to crawl from one water spot to another in a short period, short distance. These are not pretty catfish. That's one type of fish in the Sea of Galilee. The Gentiles were happy to catch them, but there was no great market for them at that area. And the second is what the little boy had who had the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. His 2 fishes were sardines. They're a Sea of Galilee or Sea of Tiberias type of sardine, which makes Jesus' miracle all the more dramatic. 5 rolls of bread and 2 sardines, and he feeds 5,000. That is phenomenal. They still catch those sardines today in the Sea of Galilee, though those who are hook and line fishing like to use them for bait to try to catch one of the other things. So this is the sea population there, but the main fish there is tilapia. They have a tilapia there that today even the Israelis call it St. Peter's fish. And it was the tilapia that ancient Roman writers described as coming out of the Sea of Galilee and being shipped to Rome, where they were in great demand. How did they ship them without refrigeration? Salting. Although they often use the word for pickling, but they would salt them, have them sent to Rome, and Romans found them a tremendous delicacy. Just something about that type of tilapia there. Tilapia, most of us have eaten them at one time or another. They're a main food fish. They're the 3rd most commonly eaten food fish in America today. The great majority come from China, but they can be grown in the United States and are grown in the United States. And as anyone who has tried to grow them in the United States will tell you, there's 4 things you say about tilapia. They breed like rabbits. They grow like weeds. You catch one, he fights like a smallmouth. And they taste like chicken. And you can flavor them any way you want because they taste like chicken. I have caught a tilapia weighing 1 pound, and I would have sworn I had a bass well over 5 pounds. Those muscle-bound little fish with the white meat just fight like crazy. This is what they were fishing for. Professional fishermen on the Sea of Galilee went for tilapia. They would bring them in by nets at night. They could use a hook and line during the day. We have an example of that. 2 tax collectors come to Peter and say, do you and Jesus pay taxes? And he said, I didn't know what to tell them. And Peter and Jesus, of course, gave a lesson saying basically, it's the spiritual things that are more important than these material things. But so you and I will not give offense. Go out, cast a line. This is in daylight. And the first fish you catch will have, I thought that was interesting, the first fish you catch. For a true fisherman, catching just 1 fish is like eating 1 potato chip. You know, eating 1 peanut is just not good. But the first fish you catch, open its mouth, you'll have a coin in there worth 4 drachmas. Give it to the tax collectors for you and me. So yeah, there was hook and line fishing there too, but that was done during daylight. Net fishing was not done during daylight. It was done at night when the fish were in the shallows, and you could get them. Master Simon replied, we've worked hard all night and caught nothing, but if you say so, I'll let down the nets. When they did this, they caught a great number of fish. I assume that this was Jesus and Peter and Andrew working together in that boat. And the nets began to tear. Now, those nets had not disintegrated through lack of cleaning. They were good, strong nets. Early writers tell us they were made of flax. These were nets made of flax. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat, that is, James and John, to come and help them. They came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. Now again, that 27-foot boat, 7.5 feet wide, each one has a carrying capacity in excess of 1,650 pounds, assumed in good weather, and this is probably good weather, so two of them, minus the weight of, let's say, 5 men, who in those days probably the average man weighed 120 to 140, we're talking, well, about 1.5 tons. Could have been 1.5 tons of these invaluable tilapia. That was major money, because the Roman Empire traded these and wanted these. We have ancient writers who speak of the Sea of Galilee fish, these tilapia. Cicero himself, I believe, was the first to speak of it, and later Suetonius spoke of it. The Romano-Jewish writer Josephus, Flavius Josephus, spoke of how much the Sea of Galilee fish were loved in the city of Rome by diners. And finally, Strabo, he's a Greco-Roman writer, just right at the end of Jesus' ministry's time, that he describes how much these fish were desired. They have hauled in a boatload of money. It was beyond any fisherman's dream that their load a boat heavy, so down that it began to sink. In excess of, in one single haul, 3,000 pounds of fish, 1.5 tons of tilapia right there. That is an intensive experience. Now, they had been with Jesus already, at least for a while, but they'd gone back to fishing. And when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, because I'm a sinful man, Lord." For he and all those with him were amazed at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, Zebedee's sons, who were Simon's partners. Now that's an interesting reaction. Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. Every time God appears or his angel appears, the messenger of God appears, the reaction of people is always the same, so that God has to say, "Fear not. Do not be afraid." Isaiah, when he saw the year King Uzziah died, the Lord high and lifted up, what was his reaction? It was not, ooh, ah, wow, ow, fireworks display. No, his reaction was what? "Depart from me, Lord, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips." And the reaction of the shepherds, I don't believe the shepherds were terrified of the pyrotechnics in the night. I believe the shepherds were overcome by the holiness of God's presence. And when you are hit by the holiness of God's presence, you become acutely aware. I become acutely aware of what a sinner I am. Because we stand there spiritually naked before God, and he knows our sin, and he knows the things in our hearts and our minds that in going out would pollute us. And he sees all that. And we, if we're honest with ourselves, are very conscious of our shortcomings, very conscious of our failings, very conscious of the fact that this is a holy God, and anything unholy cannot touch him or be associated with him. Unworthiness is what I feel in the presence of a holy God. Whatever my sins, and all sins are condemning, and there's no sin that can tear us away from God's love if we offer him our heart. And that's the greatest miracle of all, that he could look at our sinful heart and want us anyway. We're honest with ourselves. We know we have a lot to be afraid of in terms of our lack of holiness, in terms of the comparison of what we got to God's holiness. There's a lot that we would have to be afraid of. Jesus himself said, "Fear not he who can destroy the body, but fear him who has the power to cast you." into hell. God's holiness cannot tolerate sin, and Peter was instantly aware of that. I address this to teachers out there. I'm looking at Eddie as a former school teacher. If you've read, and I invite this for any kindergarten up through college teachers, if you've looked at Peter's personality at any time in your life, is he the type of student you would likely report to the office as being ADD, ADHD, and problems with impulse control? I think the answer is yes. All of the above. Those aren't sins in and of themselves, but it does show the fact that Peter tended to wear things on his sleeve, and what he had about him was right up front. And he knew that there were things in him that just were not holy. Now, his ability to take in things was fascinating. I mean, we look through everything mentioned of him in the Bible, and he amuses me sometimes in the way that an ADD child, we can't help but be amused by their outbursts occasionally or things like that. Yet, he becomes the leader of the disciples. He becomes God's hand-picked leader for the disciples in his lifetime. For his lifetime, he was a leader of the early church. And didn't mean he couldn't be corrected. Paul corrected him more than once, I believe. But we should always hold that out to our brothers. If we are corrected, we should not feel like we are being judged in some harsh way. We need to judge each other, but we need to judge ourselves first. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Judge as you would have yourself judged. As I've gotten older, I've learned more and more about the old saying, he who lives in a glass house should not throw stones, for more than one reason. But Peter, in total honesty, the total honesty which was his characteristic, often a characteristic of an ADD person or an ADHD person, is sometimes they are going to impulsively burst out complete honesty, unfiltered. And Peter did it at this moment. He said, go away from me because I'm a sinful man, Lord. That's quite an admission. That's an admission from the heart. That's an admission where you're not worried about your own ego anymore. That is the humility that God looks for. That is the humility that saves. That is the humility that God seeks in all of us, like a little child, the honesty of a little child. For he and all those with him were amazed at the catch of the fish. Don't be afraid, Jesus told Simon. From now on, you will be catching people. Then they brought the boats to land, left everything, and followed him. This is when their career as professional fishermen was surrendered to God. There's all types of things that God might be wanting us to surrender to him, things that we should give up. I can still remember an obsession I had with coin collecting in 7th and 8th grade. And I would just really get into it. And then one day, God spoke to me and said, you're too obsessed. Back away. And I did. Even when I cut on a cable channel and they have a 1932 gold coin on there, I just, whatever. I don't need to go there again. I don't need to fall into that. God has his own direction for us to follow. Bill Bright was the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, and how many millions, if not hundreds of millions of people were touched by his ministry over the years and through the Jesus film that he joined together with others to help create and that he had originally suggested. I mean, incredible the number of people. Some people credit Campus Crusade for Christ with pulling the teeth out of the anti-war movement in 69 and 70 because the revival that began to hit in certain college campuses pulled young would-be communists out of there and brought them to a saving knowledge of Jesus. And the truth is, in 1941, he had no greater desire in all the world than to join the U.S. military and fight for his country. And every time he went, they said, you have the flattest feet we've ever seen. Flattest feet ever. And he finally thought he had the flat feet thing licked. He'd worked for years standing on rollers trying to unflatten his feet, and something else came up. And all the way to the end of the war, he was 4F, 4F, 4F. And he said, "Why, oh Lord, I want nothing more than that." And God said, "I want something more for you than that. You're not to go in there to either take life or even defend life. You are to win souls. Your purpose is to catch people, catch the souls, rescue the perishing, care for the dying in the more important sense than the physical, and that is the spiritual sense of things." And so that's the way his life direction went. You know, Dr. Samuel Johnson of England in the 1700s said something that I've often thought about. Every man feels meanly about himself for not having served in the military. And that's how Bill Bright was feeling. But then he realized there was something more significant, something greater. And hundreds of thousands of military men were touched by his ministry. So God's direction is not our direction. Peter was an expert fisherman, but Jesus showed him even an expert doesn't know more than God knows. God's vision is greater. We need to surrender ourselves to him completely. Something I've learned over the years, honesty. Being an honest person, no matter what it costs you. I don't mean carry it to the extent Peter sometimes did, where he was blurting out the wrong thing at the wrong time, but I would say don't speak in a way that will spin things in your favor. Don't work in a way that will spin things in your favor. Don't hedge the truth. You might think you're escaping some difficulty in the workplace with your boss, with someone else who's an authority over you, by not giving the whole thing because it'll make you look bad, or not speaking the whole thing because it'll make you look bad. I see you're late to work today. Did you have a trouble with your car? Well, I always have trouble with my car. But I say, no, I just flat got up late. No, that's not the best thing you can say to a boss. That's just one example. I've learned not to say what is not it. I've learned not to say why. Because God often blesses us God will bless us through our honesty. It may be hard. There may be a hard road to hoe in the meantime. We may have to pay a price for our honesty. But God wants to use us, and he can't use us if we are dishonest. I'm not saying too much information. There is a level of that can go too far, and especially you irritate people. Too much information can do that, or you creep them out. But nonetheless, don't hide the truth. Don't put a spin on it that makes you sound better. There's a politician some years ago who's being interviewed on a late night talk show, and they asked him what he knew about technology. And he made this statement exactly word for word. As a congressman, he was a senator, as a congressman, I undertook the initiative to create the internet. And technically, it was true. He and several other congressmen had gotten the bill through Congress in the late 80s that jumped America to where we could have things like Prodigy and AOL and eventually everything else. The internet had already existed. It had been formed in the U.S. Army in the 1960s and as a local thing. Dartmouth University had it in an intra-campus thing in the early 70s. But he stated it that way. As a congressman, I undertook the initiative to create the internet. Technically true. If he had said, I joined with other congressmen, and we together managed to get this through Congress so that the internet could happen in a worldwide way. That's not exactly how he said it. As a result, he got hammered in his political career ever since with the statement, I invented the internet. That's not what he said, but that's how the slight spin could be twisted more than he wanted it to be twisted. We need to have point blank humility and honesty about ourselves, and God can use us. Then God can use us. That's being submitted to him, being submitted to his will, being